It is the other aspect where the simple moments of the notion of organism are compared with the moments of the outer structure that would first furnish the genuine law expressing the true outer as a copy of the inner. Now, because those simple moments are pervasive fluid properties, they do not have in the organic thing such a separate real expression as what is called an individual system of the shape. Or again, if the abstract idea of the organism is truly expressed in those three moments merely because they are not static and are only moments of the notion and of movement, the organism, on the other hand, as a structured shape, is not exhaustively dealt with in the three specific systems into which it is analyzed by anatomy. Insofar as such systems are supposed to be found actually existing and to be authenticated by being so found, it must also be borne in mind that anatomy presents us not only with three such systems, but with a good many more. Furthermore, apart from this, the system of sensibility as a whole must mean something quite different from what is called the nervous system, the irritable system, something quite different from the muscular system, the reproductive system, something different from the intestinal mechanism of reproduction. In the systems of shape as such, the organism is apprehended from the abstract aspect of a dead existence. Its moments so taken pertain to anatomy and the corpse, not to cognition and the living organism. In such parts, the moments have really ceased to be, for they cease to be processes. Since the being of the organism is essentially a universality or a reflection into self, the being of its totality, like its moments, cannot consist in an anatomical system. On the contrary, the actual expression of the whole and the externalization of its moments are really found only as a movement which runs its course through the various parts of the structure, a movement in which what is forcibly detached and fixed as an individual system essentially displays itself as a fluid moment. Consequently, that actual existence as it is found by anatomy must not be reckoned as its real being, but only that existence taken as a process, in which alone even the anatomical parts have a meaning. As we start moving into paragraph 276, Hegel has been criticizing this whole notion of law as traditionally understood in observation of nature as applied to the organic being. And we've seen why the organic being presents certain problems when we try to make it analogous to things that are covered by other physical laws. Now Hegel is, in this paragraph, really going to bring out two of his main criticisms, and they're closely connected. You notice I've got this entire schema up here. This by now is quite familiar to you if you've been following along with these videos. We have what he calls the simple moments of the notion of organism, or the inner, right? The inner to the organism, sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. We've been talking about those now for several paragraphs. Here, on the other side, is what Miller translates by outer structure, the moments of the outer structure. The German term there is the Gestaltung should be. And we've seen that Hegel is using this term Gestalt here to mean the external structure. So, for example, the muscular system is a structure. The skeletal system is a structure. It's something that you can observe. You can cut apart a corpse and start, peeling off the things and seeing where the nerves run and all that sort of stuff. And you can do that with humans, and you can do that with other animals. You can do that with plants, the systems that they have. And we, in our own time, have some very, very sophisticated techniques for getting at more of the outer, getting at, you might say, some of the inner of the outer, but we're not getting at the inner itself. So Hegel is going to go on and raise some very important criticisms. He says, what's supposed to be happening is that we've got this law in place that the outer is the expression of the inner. And how does that work out? We've got the outer here, right? And we've got these three moments of it, these simple moments. And they're supposed to correspond to what we can actually observe, which are these three systems. And these systems are in a certain way supposed to be not just an expression, but kind of a copy of what's going on over here. Hegel's going to point out a problem with that right away. These are what he calls pervasive fluid properties. This is not something new, but now you're seeing some of the implications of that. So he says, these are pervasive fluid properties, so they don't have in the organic thing a separate real expression as what is called an individual system of the shape. Over here, with what we can observe, like I said, you could take my body, now you kill me in the process, but you could take my body and separate out, say, the muscular system from the nervous system, from the intestinal system, from the skeletal system, from other systems as well, right? But you cannot do that, as Hegel has pointed out previously, with a being in terms of these moments of its consciousness, of what consciousness that it has. So what implications does that have? He says, if the abstract idea of the organism is truly expressed in those three moments, merely because they're not static and only moments of the notion, the organism is not exhaustively dealt with in the three specific systems into which it is analyzed by anatomy. Now, not the anatomy of our time. If you were to take an anatomy and physiology class, you'd buy a giant thick textbook that costs you a lot of money because there's a lot of systems being examined. But at the time, these were the main ones that the anatomists seemed to be interested in correlating to the basic functions of the organism. So Hegel is saying, look, there's two problems here. One is, every single one of these is not adequately expressed in its particular correlate over here. So sensibility is not going to be found just in the nervous system, but as we saw, again, in previous paragraphs, running throughout the entire living organism. Now he's raising another issue too, which is that these three systems aren't really enough. It was tempting to try to, we said, well, we've got three over here, so there must be three corresponding over here. But we've got a remainder, you might say, right? This doesn't go into this without leaving a remainder, if we want to use the very loose metaphor of division, because there's other systems to the body, to the organic being. So he goes on and he says, insofar as these systems are to be found actually existing and to be authenticated by being found, we have to bear in mind that anatomy presents us not only with three such systems, but with a good many more. So the question then is, all the other stuff that's over here, how do we read that back into what's going on over here? So nervous system, for example, is being called into question in two major ways. Does the nervous system encompass or express all of what is sensibility? No, and there may be other systems that themselves are closer, or at least, tangentially related to sensibility. And we can say the same thing for each one of these. So Hegel goes down and he says, the system of sensibility as a whole must mean something quite different from what is called the nervous system. And again, I've pointed out in a few past videos that here the person who Hegel actually reminds me of the most is somebody who did draw quite a bit from Hegel, and that would be Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French 20th century philosopher, who was also a phenomenologist, studied under Husserl, but incorporated quite a bit from Hegel. Merleau-Ponty pointed out that perception does not simply reside in the perceptive organs, but runs throughout the entire human being, and we might say similarly the other basic functions as well, the irritability and the reproduction, at least as Hegel is conceiving it here. So he says, in the systems of shape as such, the organism is apprehended, and here's the problem, from the abstract aspect of a dead existence. Now, why is that a big problem? Well, what are we supposed to be examining here? Are we supposed to be looking at, as he's going to say, a cadaver? Or are we supposed to be observing and understanding a living organism? if we're not actually getting to a real organism here, and by real I don't mean that it has, you know, worldly existence, but that it truly is an organism, these systems aren't very helpful to us. And you know, here's what you can say. In an anatomy textbook, or you know, in an observation when you're dissecting a cadaver, these are quite discrete from each other, and you can see how they're working. And we have computer-generated models now where you can see them in sort of action, but not real action. In order to see them as living, as the real being of the organism, we have to look at living beings, and not just at dead things, which happen to be a bit more convenient and easier to work on because they stay still, because they don't wriggle, because they don't sort of escape the grasp of our reason. So he says, since the being of the organism, this part over here, is essentially a universality or reflection in itself, the being of its totality would be this entire thing, the inner and the outer. The being of its totality cannot consist in an anatomical system. On the contrary, the actual expression of the whole and the externalization of the moments, where are we to find them? This is where it gets really interesting. This is where Hegel actually, you might say, prefigures somebody like Henri Bergson as well, who, of course, Merleau-Ponty drew upon, right? The being of the organism, on the contrary, the actual expression of the whole, are really found only as a movement which runs its course through the various parts of the structure. A movement in which what is forcibly detached and fixed as an individual system displays itself as a fluid moment. Consequently, that actual existence must be, as found by anatomy, must not be reckoned as its real being, but only that existence taken as a process in which even the anatomical parts have a meaning. So what is Hegel saying there? Anatomy is nice, but it's at best approximative. It can teach us things. You know, for example, I want to know how the elbow works. Anatomy can tell me a lot about that. But anatomy can't tell me about how the elbow works in its function in an organism, a living being that is, you might say, motivated. That is, you know, as Aristotle called it, a self-moved mover to some extent. So the truth of these external systems of the organism, not external to the organism, but how it externalizes itself, are to be found in how the inner expresses itself in the outer, not the outer as mere copies or stand-ins for the inner. We see then that the moments of the organic inner taken by themselves are incapable of furnishing the aspects of a law of being, since in such a law they are asserted of an outer existence, are distinguished from one another, and neither aspect could be equally named in place of the other. Further, that placed on one side, they do not find in the other side their realization in a fixed system. For this latter would as little possess any organic truth, that is, the truth of organic being, as it would be the expression of those moments of the organic inner. The essential nature of organic being, since it is in itself the universal, rather consists in general in its moments being equally universal in actual existence, that is, in their being pervasive processes, but not in giving an image of the universal in an isolated being. Here in paragraph 277, Hegel is saying that we actually don't have a law that applies to the organic that can capture what he's calling here organic truth, or as Miller is glossing it in those brackets, the truth of organic being, which I think is a legitimate thing to do because Hegel, just a little bit after that, talks about the essential nature of organic being, the Wesentliche, of organic being. So what's very important here is that Hegel is drawing some further conclusions from the previous paragraph, and we should think about what the failure of finding this law amounts to for us. Is it merely throw our hands up and say, oh, well, we tried. Observing reason isn't really going to stop there, but it is encountering a setback. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next paragraph, what the significance of that is. Here, let's concentrate on the critique. He says, the moments of the organic inner taken by themselves are incapable of furnishing a law, furnishing the aspects of a law of being. Why? Because in such a law, they're asserted of an outer existence, right? The outer existence here, and they're treated as being separate from each other, even though their reality is such that they actually are interconnected within the being. And what we're talking about here is what Hegel's calling a fluid dynamism. So insofar as the law that we want here is, you might say, transposing them in relation to these fixed systems that are supposed to be separate from each other in the outer, even though they are fused into one organism, they're still distinguishable from each other once you kill the organism and dissect it. We're distorting the picture of what's going on this side. So it doesn't turn out to be a very good law if the purpose of the law was to lend intelligibility, because the very way in which we're framing the law is, you might say, falsifying this side. And this is actually, in some respects, the side that we know the best, because we are organic beings. We are organisms, and we have these functions going on. So he says, neither aspect could be equally named and placed the other. Placed on one side, they don't find in the other side their realization in a fixed system, because this wouldn't possess organic truth. So it wouldn't provide to us the truth of organic being. The truth in the fuller sense, not just in the correspondence theory sense, but you might say in a global sense that Hegel's interested in, is not found in the lowercase truths of anatomy that you might find in a textbook or being taught to you in a course, or with a computer program or platform. So he goes on and he says the essential nature of organic being, since it is in itself the universal. Remember, what we're talking about here, go back to those previous paragraphs where the individual being is indeed a universal. Hegel had that paradoxical framing of this. This is where some of those birds that took off at that point come to roost, right? This organic being is a universal, and he says in its moments, its moments are equally universal in actual existence. They are pervasive processes, but they don't give an image of the universal in an isolated being. So these being pervasive processes, they are properties as well, but being pervasive processes means that, like we've said before, sensibility runs throughout the entire organism. Reproduction does as well. They fuse into each other. They are not distinct parts or systems the way that we imagine them to be, because we're looking at the external and trying to distinguish them apart from each other. And again, I've mentioned this before. Aristotle says something similar in the De Anima, that the parts of the soul are not really parts as such, we sort of imagine that sort of structure to them, but that's really a function of our ways of observing. So Hegel here is saying, look, if we're trying to get at what the reality is, the truth of organic being, this is more like what we've got and not this over here, which is supposed to be its expression. So the law is not going to stand. In this way, the idea of a law in the case of organic being is altogether lost. The law wants to grasp and express the antithesis as inert aspects, and in them the determinateness which is their relation to one another. The inner, to which the manifested universality belongs, and the outer, to which belong the parts of the inert shape, were supposed to constitute the corresponding aspects of the law. But, as thus held apart, they lose their organic significance. And what lies at the base of the idea of law is precisely this, that each of its two aspects should have an independent, indifferent subsistence of its own, the relation of the aspects being shared between them as a twofold determinateness, corresponding to that relation. The fact is that each aspect of the organism is in its own self just this, to be a simple universality in which all determinations are dissolved, and to be the movement of this process. Paragraph 278 is bringing this critical examination of a law as conceived of as applying to organic being to a close. And I want to think, as we conclude this little portion, about what the upshot or the outcome of not having attained a law really ought to be understood as within Hegel's system, and also by analogy to some other philosophers. I'm thinking in particular about Plato and the operatic dialogues. But let's see first where Hegel is going. He says that what we're trying to strive for is this law of organic being. And he says that we've lost it. We've lost the idea of a law of organic being, and why? Well, the law wants to grasp the inner and the outer. And we've said that, it's been trying to think of the relation between them as this, that the inner is expressed in some way in the outer. And we've seen that the problem is that it's taking essentially an analogy, working backwards from the outer into the inner. In the outer, we do have, as he's calling it here, parts of the inert shape, the gestalt, right? Or as we've called them before, the systems, and those are available to us by anatomical observation. But the problem with that is that when we try to read that back into the inner, we've seen that we can in fact do that. That's a possibility, but there's no guarantee that that's going to be read in, you might say, properly or adequately. You could say that observation gives us enough rope to hang ourselves with. And the problem is, as we've seen already, twofold. We don't actually know if a given part corresponds to the totality of a function. As it turns out, it probably doesn't. The other problem is that we can isolate these out from each other, but like Aristotle pointed out in his discussion of the hand, you cut a hand off from a body and it's no longer truly a hand. It's a hand in an equivocal sense. It's no longer a dynamic, organic, living system. It no longer has its functionality. It's just inert meat. And so we're getting a false picture of how things are on this end by looking at this. For example, when we engage in anatomy, or something that was very popular back a little bit after Hegel, psychometrics, all these sorts of observational activities. The problem is that the inner doesn't really manifest itself that way. It manifests itself as a universality, so that reproduction is running throughout the whole of the organism as the outer, but also pervading the entirety of the inner. And it's overlapping with or interpenetrating with irritability and sensibility, and whatever other functions we have. We've only talked about 3 so far. We could make it more complicated if we want to. I mean, previous philosophers certainly did, right? We might talk about the intellect, for example, as a system in this way. Or we might talk about other things. In any case, the problem stands. He says, the inner and the outer were supposed to constitute the corresponding aspects of the law. But thus held apart, they lose their organic significance. In the process of trying to isolate them out, which makes good sense, we lose our hold on what they are. He says, what lies at the base of the idea of this law is this. Each of its 2 aspects should have an independent, indifferent subsistence on its own, the relation of the aspects being shared between them as a twofold determinateness corresponding to that relation. So what it does is it sets up this antithesis, which is there between the inner and the outer, this Gegensatz, right? Contradiction, we could say. The other part. And it treats this side as inert, and then it also treats this side as inert. It treats them as actually separable from each other, when they are distinguishable but not truly separable. And therefore then looks for the relation between them, but can't really grasp what that relation is, and we lose the law of organic being. You know, you could say here that in a certain way what Hegel is doing is stressing a point which Aristotle and then Thomas Aquinas had made, that being distinguishable is not the same thing as being separable from each other. And so in certain things, if you do try to separate them out, you're going to screw up your picture of them. And one of the main currents in modern philosophy, pervading not just modern philosophy, but because of philosophy's connection with natural science and with the developing social sciences or human sciences, was this notion that we begin by separating everything out. Think about Descartes and his rules of method. They work great for certain things. Do they work great as a universal method? No. Do they work particularly well for organic beings? I don't think so. And we can say similarly for many other philosophers. Now, I did say I wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of not being able to find a law. And like I put here, sort of the heading, examining the law ended up negating the law. Let's think about what negation means here. Just go back to Hegelian determinate negation, right? Not all negation is simply wiping the slate clean and saying, oh, we can't do anything. I want to say that there's an analogy here between what Hegel is doing and what is happening in Platonic operatic dialogues. The operatic dialogues are the ones in which they reach an aporia, that is a place where you're literally hemmed in and you can't go any further. So a lot of the earlier dialogues, at least the ones that are assumed to be earlier by the scholars, are operatic in that sense. They try to figure out, for example, what courage is in the law case, and they never actually arrive at a satisfactory definition of courage. Likewise, in the Euthyphro, they try to figure out what piety or holiness is, and they don't arrive at it. Now, what you have to ask there is, are these dialogues complete failures then, because they didn't attain the object? And if you have a skeptical point of view, and you interpret Socrates as sort of a proto-skeptic, the guy who says, yes, I am wise because I realize I don't know anything, that's only a little bit of Socrates. Socrates actually knows a hell of a lot. And he unveils that as they go along in the dialogue. There are, with every operatic dialogue, some very important achievements that happen along the way, and they're not all completely negative, of saying, well, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. There's a lot of knowledge being exchanged back and forth, but because people are looking at that over there, they're missing what's happening over here. I would say something similar is happening in all of these discussions of law. We are gradually learning more and more about how Hegel conceives of organic beings, even though we're not finding the law that we want to have. So what we've got going on here is a determinate negation rather than just a merely, privative negation, let's call it.